Thank you, Ross and Frank, for being here. Thanks to all of you for taking time on a busy weeknight, putting aside your homework for this conversation we're going to have. I was thinking about cliches that I associate with college, and I think there's this idea that you get to stay up till 3 a.m. talking about the meaning of life with your roommate, but I don't know that that actually happens as much as it should in all of the grind of trying to get your work done, extracurriculars, all of your commitments. There's just not a lot of time left over, often a lot of bandwidth for reflecting on what all of that striving is actually for. And so tonight we're going to try to get into the kind of questions underneath the questions and think through the different paths that both of our guests have taken, and where there are some continuities, where there are some tensions. So where I thought we could start is I would love for both of you to take us back to your own college days and tell us, did you, between ages 18 and 22, did you have a theory about the meaning of life? And if so, where did it come from? And is it the same now?
You really want me to?
I want you to go first. Yes, Frank. Yes, I do.
Well, first I should mention, to redeem the part of my introduction that had to do with the school down the road, my college days were here at UNC. And I don't know about the meaning of life. When I think about what were the kind of North Stars of my college experience, I was part of a group that never scheduled a class at 1 p.m. because that's when all my children played. And we would all watch it in the student union together. I did stay up late many nights, but it was less devoted to the meaning of life and more to the meaning of whiskey. I think college is a rehearsal for the rest of life, and I'm sure if I wanted to kind of think of it from a certain angle and think of it deeply, learning what people meant to me and what they meant in a life, and how important it was to surround yourself with a caring community to which you contributed and from which you drew. I think all of that happens in college. In my case, it was never attached to any great philosophical construct or any religious one. And I should say, I feel a little awkward here tonight. I know it's my role to be here, but I am not someone who prays. I'm not someone who belongs to any organized church. I'm not someone who's sure what I think about any of that. I don't subscribe to any creed. So I will just say at the outset, as a sort of apology and something, I feel a little bit like I'm a vegan who was invited to a steakhouse, and you want me to review the porterhouse. And I would like it medium rare, for the record. But so I'm going to try my best to keep pace or contribute something tonight. And I think what we'll see is that much of what I find meaningful in life, and much of the things that I think are important, are probably the exact same things that you and Ross do. It's just I have a different vocabulary for them.
I mean, that is why we've brought you here, yes, tonight, Frank, it's true, for an intervention.
But I do
no.
I did say to them backstage, like, am I going to get baptized on stage? Something like.
And we have an hour and 10 minutes to get there. So that was a nice, terse, maybe slightly evasive answer, Frank. I feel like I want to hear more about your college experience. But so I did come to college with a worldview because I had a sort of strange family religious pilgrimage throughout my childhood, where we started out Episcopalian, and then we were Pentecostalist and evangelical, and then ended up as Roman Catholic. So we covered a large part of the American religious landscape between the ages of 6 and 17. And I would like to say that meant that college for me was a sort of rich, intense engagement with, the deepest and most meaningful religious texts and arguments, the big questions of the kind that the Veritas Forum exists to engage with, and so on. But in fact, when I think back on my life, college was certainly it was by far the least religious portion of my life. I did manage to drag myself to the 5 p.m. student mass most weekends. I maintained some kind of practice of the Catholic faith, but I would say that in terms of like what I was engaged with in college, it was a combination of a really good and important but sort of immediate form of socialization and social engagement that I think tracks with what you were describing, Frank, where college, in my memory, is about a set of friendships that have been with me ever since. I met my wife in college, like all kinds of things that were important to my sort of intimate personal life story were set in college. And when I give people advice about college, I often lean on that, right? I say, look, there's lots of moments in your life where you might find a really good group of friends or a potential spouse, but college is particularly well suited to that, and particularly well suited in an age of sort of virtual life and the atomization created by digital existence and so on, because at least in a residential college you are thrust together physically with large groups of other people who might be your real friends in a way that like their reality is unavoidable. In a way it isn't necessarily once you have an apartment on your own and you can order food from DoorDash and watch Netflix and and so on. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that college, I went to a school in the Northeast close to Boston that has a certain reputation for aggressive, obnoxious ambition. And it did, in fact, teach me to be aggressively, obnoxiously ambitious to a degree that I probably had or I wouldn't have been there in the first place.
Is this color a familiar one to you from that school?
It's a slightly
not to
off.
Give it away.
It's not precise.
Not to give it away because that was so well cloaked.
Yeah.
No one could have guessed.
But yeah, I mean, in that sense, there was a side of college that I felt like you could say it was strong preparation for the life I've ended up having, writing, like Frank, a column for, a major American newspaper and, existing journalists aren't but adjacent to realms of political power and so on. You could say it prepared me for that. But I think in many ways it made me a worse person, that aspect of elite college education, that I acquired a set of ambitions and expectations that were more worldly than anything that I had experienced before I went to college. And that was sort of, there was an inculcation, I think, of worldliness in college that had influence thereafter.
To the extent that both of you spend a fair amount of time having opinions in public about really important stuff, where do those opinions come from, right? When you think about your reactions, the lanes along which you judge the issues you write about, can you trace those views to a particular developmental point? Maybe it wasn't college, maybe it was after, but why are you broadly in the political ideological camps you're in? Is it a relationship, a mentor?
You want me to go first?
It's your turn to go first.
It's my turn to go first, yeah. I mean, I think that for me we had this weird sort of religious drama in my childhood, and my parents were liberal Democrats when it started, and they were probably moderate Democrats when it ended. And so in part my own trajectory as a conservative was set by sort of taking the movement created by the religious journey and adding a certain kind of like political rebellion to it. And a lot of that was set in certain ways just by the end of high school, right? And that I was sort of, I grew up in Southern Connecticut. I was, apart from our religious experiments, I was around political liberals most of the time. I am some kind of natural contrarian. I think temperament enters into one's perspective a lot, right? That like, if you placed someone with the same temperament in completely different conditions, they might end up with a very different ideology because they would react against whatever they were around, right? So I reacted against a prevailing liberalism, and it sort of set me on a particularly, a particular course to being a conservative within liberal spaces, which is strangely or not strangely the professional identity I've always had. I think that I think there's something beyond politics, though, where my having a weird religious childhood gave me a general appreciation for weirdness, I think, that sort of goes beyond my particular political commitments and has become more important to me as I've gotten older. You asked about change, right, in worldviews. I think especially as the world itself has grown weirder in various ways in the last 5 or 10 years, and, you know, we can talk about what that means exactly, but I feel like my sort of childhood experiences with weirdness have become more relevant to the world as it presents itself to us, and therefore have become more relevant to me. So there's an element of that as well, where it's not so much about a particular ideology as it is towards a sort of expectation that things are going to happen or may be happening in the world that don't necessarily fit into sort of conventional expectations of how the world works. You know?
I feel like I should find some sort of joke connecting Ross's testimony about an appreciation for weirdness and his Republican identity. I feel like something's hanging there for the taking, but I'm just not nimble and witty enough tonight to do it. I grew up to the extent that politics was even discussed in my household, which wasn't a lot. My dad was and remained for his whole life a Republican. My mother, I kind of never really knew what she was. She was just kind of sensible and centrist. More of my relatives were Republican than not. But to the extent that I gravitated toward the Democratic Party, I think there were really two things. One was I was very close to my Italian immigrant grandparents, and I was kind of raised in a household that was very close to its immigrant roots. And so there was a sense a little bit of being outsiders. And then I realized at a very young age that I was gay. And if you go back to that era of time, if the political party that called to you was the one that seemed more open to diversity, less judgmental, more concerned then with marginalized people, you ended up being attracted to the Democratic Party, because I'm describing some of the best things about the Democratic Party. And to the extent that the Democratic Party has fallen on such tough times recently and alienated a lot of people, it's because it stopped being the less judgmental party and in some ways started becoming the more judgmental party. But it was the welcoming home. Back when I was a young person, back in my teens and my 20s, it was the much more welcoming home if you were an outsider in certain ways. When I was at UNC as a student, that is when the AIDS crisis took off, right? And the reactions to the AIDS crisis and to the deaths of so many gay men were very different in the Republican and Democratic parties. And the reaction was much, much more humane and much more merciful and much more oriented towards saving lives and finding solutions in the Democratic Party. And I think the things that we see, the ways in which we see political parties behaving when we're in our kind of college years and right afterward, I think leave an imprint that stays for your whole life.
This is so helpful. I think we have kind of the general ways you located yourself on the landscape of ideas and politics and culture. But part of tonight's mandate is to talk about suffering. And suffering, moments of acute crisis, this is where maybe the vague pieces of your worldview that have remained inchoate, you haven't really had to think about, they often come to the surface and get challenged. Both of you in recent years went from a place of reasonably good health to acute suffering very quickly. And I wondered if you could tell us, just sketch out what happened for those folks in the room who may not know the stories. Frank, tell us about the morning when you woke up and could no longer see properly.
Yeah, so in October of 2017, I woke up one morning and something was really wrong, really funky, really screwy with my vision. And at first I thought there was something in one of my eyes, or I thought maybe I'd had too many glasses of wine the previous night, because sometimes I have too many glasses of wine, and I thought like maybe I needed a run, maybe I needed a shower, etc. And I remember exactly what I was doing. Oddly enough, I was trying to transcribe a long tape that I'd recorded with George W. Bush's two daughters, because they were about to publish a book called Sisters First, kind of about their relationship, but also about growing up in a political family. And because I'd done a lot of reporting on the Bushes over the years, I had kind of a privileged first look interview. And I was trying to transcribe it, and the words were just swimming and vibrating and doing weird things on the screen. To make a long story short, over the next few days, as I saw a series of eye doctors, I learned that I had had a kind of stroke of the optic nerve, and that the optic nerve connecting my right eye to my brain had essentially died, and that I would be pretty much okay because you can live a very healthy life. You legally can drive with what is technically known as monocular vision, but it just takes a while for your brain to kind of to edit your bad eye out of the equation so that your good eye can help you see normally. But the other whammy of all of that is in that first week or first 2 weeks when I was going through tests I never knew existed, all sorts of weird machines and vision tests, I was told that the particular thing that had caused me to lose vision in my right eye, that the literature was that 20% of the time in the coming years it happens to your other eye. So it wasn't just about trying to make do with vision that was badly compromised, and still I struggle with a little bit to this day. It was also kind of learning that for the rest of your life, you would kind of have this sword hanging over you, which was a 20% chance that you would go blind. Now I'm not good at arithmetic, but it's almost 8 years later, or it's 7.5 years later, and my left eye is holding steady and it's all good. I don't think about what I went through as suffering, and I've written about this. I mean, one of the things that I realized, and I truly consider this a gift, or if I was going to use more religious language, a grace, is I realized in the course of psychologically processing it and adjusting to it, that everybody suffers. That, I mean, that is the given and the default of life. And I had a limit shown to me earlier than maybe some other people. I kind of had to contemplate diminished ability and adaptations and that sort of thing sooner in a medical sense than some people do, but later than a lot of other people do. And I didn't think of it then for very long, and I don't think of it now as suffering. I think of it as a challenge. And it's my challenge, but everybody in this room probably has a challenge of commensurate difficulty or much greater. And when I did write a book about this, because one of my great blessings was I could make sense of what I was doing, and then I could actually like have someone publish it. I could go out and talk about it. One of the proudest things I feel about that book is there's a chapter in that book called The Sandwich Board Theory of Life, in which I say that one of the things I realized is most of what we are all going through, the pain we're experiencing, the challenges we're overcoming, the obstacles that intimidate us, most of those are invisible to the people around us. And if we all, like one day a month, walked around wearing a sandwich board that literally listed the bullet points of what we're dealing with that nobody knows about, fewer of us would feel self-pity, and we would be much more empathetic and kinder to the people around us, because we would realize that when we're having a difficult time relating to someone, or when they seem to be short with us, or when they seem to be dismissive, they're going through things we have no idea of, and so we should not be so quickly dismissive and judgmental.
Ross, what would your sandwich board have said over the past few years?
So the mid-2010s was the period when God decided to visit his smiting power upon New York Times columnists for reasons best known only to him. So about probably a year and a half before Frank woke up with half the vision that he had before, I decided to move with my wife and then 2 kids to an idyllic farmhouse in Connecticut, from leaving Washington, D.C. behind. My wife and I had both grown up in Connecticut. I had sort of a romantic idea about becoming the kind of person who owned a barn and had stone walls and fences and woods and so on. And so we bought a house built in 1790 that had cliffs and barns and outbuildings and all of them falling into disrepair, but I was very young at that point and had all kinds of plans about the lifestyle that we were going to lead. While we were still in the process of moving, I developed sort of very strange symptoms starting around my head and soon sort of radiating all around my body. Pain, sort of bizarre vibrations, tinglings, all kinds of things that over a really rapid period of time, like just a couple months, made my life completely unlivable. I was sleeping for about an hour a night. I was unable to keep food down most of the time. I lost 50 pounds in the space of about 5 weeks. And it was only when we actually managed to make the move to Connecticut that I started. I saw probably like 15 doctors in a, desperate 10-week span of time. And it was only when we made the move that I started seeing doctors who said things like, well, we see things like this all the time, and did you happen to walk in the fields of your beautiful New England farmhouse before you purchased it? And I said, well, of course. Why wouldn't one walk in one's fields? And that suggested the strong likelihood that a deer tick had crawled on me and bitten me, and that I had Lyme disease. And so that was sort of stage one. And the good thing was that having a diagnosis meant that I could start taking strong antibiotics and stabilize my condition. But I didn't, I went from sleeping 1 hour a night to 4.5. I went from having debilitating pain to having manageable but quite difficult pain. So I got somewhat better, but not better. And so at that point, I went from having a mystery illness to having a condition that exists in an exciting zone of medical controversy. Because with Lyme disease, the way it works is that if you take antibiotics for 4 to 6 weeks and you don't get better, the official CDC recommendations are that you're done. There's nothing more that medical science can do for you. Good luck. And about 80% of people, this is sort of contested, but let's say 80% of people who have Lyme disease do get better relatively quickly, or maybe it lingers, but they're better within a couple months. But then there's a large percentage that don't get better and get stuck in sort of chronic illness territory and have to find their way out. So I spend a long period of time in that territory I mentioned weirdness. I did a lot of very weird things, attempted all kinds of peculiar medical treatments, and eventually did manage to claw my way, and it did feel like a clawing your way kind of experience back to like 90 to 95% of health, which is where I am today. And I would second everything that Frank said about what an experience like that teaches you about sort of the nature of actual reality. And I think this is something definitely that you are unlikely to appreciate in college. You may appreciate it, but in college, the sandwich board looks different than it does in middle age. As in middle age, it looks different than it does in old age. And I think, as Frank said, what happened to both of us was a kind of acceleration where we got to experience a little bit earlier, something that is just common to the human condition. But it also was a kind of, there was a kind of opening of doors around me where I had very little psychological self-control during this period. So if you came up to me and asked me how I was going, I was liable to like start crying and tell you my entire life story and be like, hey man, I'm just here to sell you a coffee. A little awkward, right? But in that sort of vulnerability, you also would open up other people's stories, right? So, you very quickly, like you would have conversations, in a green room waiting to do a CNN hit with someone who had thought they had cancer, and then it turned out to be Lyme disease, right? And, there was a lot of specific Northeastern Lyme disease experiences, but then there's obviously just sort of the general, fraternity and sorority of suffering that many people are in without anyone around them really knowing it or having a way to acknowledge it. And you only learn that about them because you yourself have opened up to them. And then the reshaping thing that about something like chronic Lyme disease in particular is it does sort of double down on that that primary sensibility that I gained in childhood, that like, you know, once you have had the medical system fail you in a profound way, but also once you have found help and assistance in places that you would have scorned as, you know, fringe quackery before the experience happened, it can't help but change the way that you look at reality itself. And then you also have to spend a certain amount of time preventing yourself from taking that experience too far. And this is, I think, relevant to a lot of arguments that we have in our culture right now, not just about medicine, but about sort of, you know, politics and reality itself. There are a lot of people who have an experience like I did that causes them to question a particular aspect of received wisdom or establishment thinking, who then find themselves pulled all the way to a world where everything that the establishment says must be wrong. And, you know, everything that's said on the fringe must be correct. And you end up with a landscape polarized between people who haven't had a bad experience with sort of conventional wisdom and so can't imagine why anyone would question it, like, you know, and people who've had a bad experience and can't imagine why anyone would believe in conventional wisdom ever again. And I think a big challenge in our society is to find a point of balance between those two places where you can acknowledge the fallibility of expertise, the failure of establishments, without going all the way to a life lived in total skepticism or total paranoia. But it's definitely a really hard balance to achieve in a way that I appreciate more now that I've been pulled in the direction of paranoia than I would have 20 years ago.
If it's not clear, both of these guys have written really great memoirs about their experiences, The Beauty of Dusk and The Deep Places. And one theme in both your books is this theme of overcoming the loneliness that can come with these acute challenges and the way you turn your situation into a mode of connecting with other people. I wondered though, you know, here you are, you're writers, you're writing about this experience. Did you ever have a sense as you were processing what you were going through and writing about it that you were trying to talk yourself into something? That, you know, as humans, we're storytelling creatures. We want things to be meaningful. We want to think that what we're going through has some significance, whatever our metaphysics, and that maybe you were writing your book to talk yourself into that?
Yes. No, but I mean, we do that, sure. I think about that to this day. I think how much of what I just said from this stage do I genuinely 100% believe, and how much of it is the narrative I'm telling myself because it's what gets me through the day. And we're here talking about religion. It's a question I have about religion. How much of religion is what we want to believe, what we will ourselves to believe, because the alternative is the universe making no sense, having no order. The alternative doesn't have much succor or mercy in it, right? I do wonder about that. It's an unanswerable question. I spent much more energy just feeling extraordinarily grateful and lucky to have spent a lifetime doing something that enabled me to give language and words to what I was going through. I thought it was an incredible privilege to have someone say, yes, I will put that between the covers of a book, to then have people review that book, to then be able to go out on stages like this one and talk about that book. And to me, the transformative experience of it was I thought, okay, it now takes me, and to this day it takes me longer to read than it used to. I have to do more and more reading through my ears. I used to be the cleanest writer you can imagine. And part of the residual effect of what happened to my vision is I have a sort of analog of dyslexia, and I will notice mistakes I never made before. I can't turn things in as quickly. I have to go back over them. But like, there's a really clear choice here, which is I can focus on that and feel sorry for myself for something that's really pretty damn incidental. Or I can like be a grown-up and say, wait a second, the fact that someone's inbox is still waiting for this piece of writing, even if it's taking me longer. The fact that that I have the privilege of being published in the New York Times and hundreds of thousands of people will read it. Like, to not focus on that and to focus on the greater difficulty
and comment
I'm
on
going
it
through
too
is ridiculous. Well, I never read my comments. we actually, I don't know if Ross knows this, and we're not going to go here, but we actually had a colleague on the opinion desk who so loved marinating in his own comments that he volunteered to moderate them. I take the opposite tack. I don't think I've ever read a comment on anything. I
don't know.
I have the wisdom of knowing how thin-skinned I am.
Yeah,
so.
I don't read the comments. What happens to me is that other people read them, and I have a lobster fisherman uncle up in Maine who's not necessarily, if you met him, the person you would imagine reading all the comments on the New York Times column. But I was on a boat with him one summer, and he was like, "Oh, Ross, they really give you hell in those comments there, don't they? Don't they?" I'm like, "What are you doing, Uncle Stephen? Don't read the comments." But yeah.
Frank, what you're saying about is religion just a story that we tell ourselves because the alternative of cold oblivion is too much to take? I mean, that really resonates with me, and I was terrified when I was investigating Christianity. Like, the thing I was most afraid of was converting out of cowardice, because I couldn't face the alternative. And Ross, you say in your memoir about Lyme disease is not nearly as focused on religion as, of course, your most recent book is, but you do say in that memoir that you're very upfront about the fact that, at least in your case, in the case of many, although not all people, this difficult time drove you toward a firmer belief rather than away because the alternative was so awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. My most recent book is essentially an argument for being religious and taking ideas about God seriously, and so on. And but I would not describe my experience with suffering as the kind of argument for religious belief that would be well designed to convince the non-believer, precisely because it falls into the category that Frank describes, right? Where, I honestly don't know how I would have gotten through the experience without some kind of belief, not even just sort of belief, not even a particular set of theological beliefs, but just to put it in the terms that you guys are using, a belief that I was inside a story and that the story had purpose and meaning and was going somewhere. And if I could get through it, it would be worth something, right? That it had some kind of payoff, that I was being asked, something was being asked of me that I could potentially live up to. And that I needed to live up to. That was incredibly important to me throughout the experience. But it was not, that's not any kind of proof for the existence of God. It's proof for the psychological utility of religion, right? And these things are not completely separate, right? I do think that reality is at least a partial counterpoint to some of the arguments that people make about, how suffering proves there couldn't possibly be a good God or anything like that. The fact that suffering does seem to bring many people closer to God, if he exists, right? And the reality that people who are sometimes in the deepest suffering are sometimes the least likely to say, this suffering shows that the universe is meaningless and pointless. They're not sort of logical proof answers, but they are sort of responsive to some of the questions around the problem of evil. But no, at a fundamental level, I could easily imagine a reasonable atheist looking at me literally lying on the floor of an empty Catholic church in suburban Connecticut with pain shooting down my shoulders, asking God for help as just, a classic sort of, people need a psychological crutch, right, to get through the hard times. I think that is not at all an unreasonable response to looking at the role that religion can play in those kind of situations. And I think, the strengthening of faith that I experienced through that experience was not, it was not a strengthening that sort of translates incredibly well out of that personal experience into the kind of argument that you might have with a skeptic.
Okay, but at some level, your experience with the presence of the divine or its absence in suffering is kind of beside the point, because your book Believe, I mean, it's concerned with this matter of what is the nature of the universe, right? How we feel about the universe on a given day is not the most fundamental question. The most fundamental question is what is true. And what I took away from your book is this message that some of us are more inclined toward metaphysical investigation than others, but if you're not so inclined, you need to get over that. And you have a certain responsibility as a member of the human species to ask these questions. Where does the universe come from? You know, are good and evil real things? My sense of you, Frank, is that you derive meaning in a very different way. Your intellectual curiosity is directed not so much at these sort of metaphysical questions and more about how do I get inside of the experiences of as many different kinds of human beings and make as many kind of connections as I can. Ross, I want you to make the case to Frank.
Oh, I told you I was going to get baptized. Now, here it comes.
But wait, I just for clarity's sake here, Frank, you were raised in a multi-generational Italian-American, you have been baptized, haven't you? I can't, right?
I'll blow your mind further, Ross. I was an altar boy.
No, I know,
Yeah.
no, I've read,
But make the case to him that he should care about metaphysics.
Yes. Okay. What do you think? What do you think is going on in the universe? I guess. Just to sharpen Molly's point a little bit.
Which universe? So we have these crazy tariffs right now.
Yes.
I mean, which universe are we talking about?
What's your basic view of why the universe exists in its current form?
I actually have no answer to that, and this maybe makes me the most shallow person in the universe.
No.
I spend no time asking it because, in a very practical sense, I know it's unanswerable. And why is that? How do you know it's unanswerable? It's unanswerable by us right now, I think. That's just my opinion. But I mean, this may seem like a digression, right? But I remember when I was in high school, like half of the known universe, I read Edith Hamilton's mythology, right? It is Edith Hamilton, right? Do I have that right? Okay, because there's so much on the hard drive that's gone, and I'm always amazed when something's still there. And I just remember thinking then and thinking now, like, people at every stage of human existence have been convinced that they solved the riddle. Like, we look back at their belief on why their beliefs about why certain things were happening in the natural world and in the universe. And we kind of laugh because it seems so crude and ridiculous. How do we know that the equivalent of this audience 1,000 years from now won't see us as being as kind of primitive and misinformed? And so that's what I mean by unanswerable. But
okay.
I'm deeply concerned, and I think you can be deeply concerned about these things and have them not be rooted in religion. I'm deeply concerned with looking back at a given week, a given year, a given month, and feeling good about the way I behaved, about the way I behaved toward other people, about the way I took care of myself. I'm deeply concerned with questions of what we all owe one another. But I just don't locate those in religion. And I have found to this moment in time, I haven't needed to feel like I'm doing some rough justice to those questions and to the sense of obligation I feel to lead an examined and constructive and purposeful life that shows as much consideration for my community as for my basic minute-by-minute desires and satiations.
Well, and I meet a lot of very committed religious people who I think are in the same zone, and that they're not concerned with these deep metaphysical, theological questions. They're concerned about how their community works and how their faith commitments cash out in their relationships with other people. So it seems like that line between people who are really pressed to answer these questions about the universe and those who think they're kind of irrelevant, that line cuts through non-believing and believing communities. It's not actually an atheist, agnostic, religious divide. Is that a fair response, though, Ross?
Well, let me say something about the ancient Greeks. I was trying to find a useful way in, so I wasn't just browbeating poor Frank. But so I think that perspective on religious debates is somewhat commonplace and also, I think, basically wrong. right? I co-taught a class at Yale last year with a friend of mine who's a philosophy professor and an atheist, and the conceit of the class was we were going to look at arguments about and around the existence of God and the meaning of the universe in the ancient world and the modern world, and sort of compare them and see, how much has changed, right? Is it the case that we have made all of this progress, and the ancient Greeks were just arguing about, spirits causing everything to happen in a sort of wild, bizarre, enchanted universe, and we've sort of progressed beyond that and have a much more reasonable set of perspectives on the world. And this was not only my conclusion. This was, I think, also the conclusion of my friend and colleague, that in fact there's actually a tremendous amount of continuity in the kinds of questions that people ask about the world and the way they argue about it. And obviously, scientific progress creates changes in the kind of arguments and the way arguments are formulated. But if you go back to the ancient world and look at the arguments that people who didn't believe in God or were deeply skeptical were making, they have a lot in common with the arguments that, for instance, you'll hear from an atheist physicist today about how we should assume that the universe we're in is orderly and rational and law-bound because it's just one of a near infinite number of universes, right? That, like this sort of multiverse hypothesis that if you watch Marvel movies, you're very familiar with, right? Like that has clear antecedents. They don't use the term multiverse, right? But when people in the ancient world are called upon to explain how the universe could exist without some kind of ordering intelligence behind it, they'll say, well, it must be that the universe is infinite and some parts of it are totally chaotic and ours just happens to be orderly. And they're doing the same kind of argument, right? There's real similarity there. And I think the same is true in arguments among religious groups and believers, right? Like, ancient peoples were not, in fact, sort of, they were not as simple-minded as, not that Frank was calling them simple-minded, but that there were, in fact, very sophisticated debates from the beginning about, polytheism versus monotheism, right? And, whether it made sense to believe in one God or many gods and all of those kind of things.
What about moral realism? Like, does it bother you? Is it a problem if you are acting on the basis of confident moral instincts that you can't provide a logical syllogism for? Or as long as they sort of work in the world, is that fine? And then I love your thoughts on this too. Like, is moral realism something that we really need? And does that change depending on our cultural moment? So as we are seeing in our own culture, maybe you could have this, you could post this as a global question too. Are we seeing a kind of breakdown in a consensus over what's sort of clearly good and what's clearly evil that is going to make the stakes of whether or not moral claims are based in a metaphysical reality important in the way that they haven't been, as we're sort of been coasting on the fumes of Christendom for the past few generations?
Wow. We're definitely seeing an enormous difference of opinion about what is good and what is not good. My mind keeps flashing back to Washington, and my mind keeps flashing back to all the self-professedly religious people who are enthusiastically supporting and backing and propping up Donald Trump. This is the most quotidian, basic, unsophisticated, non-metaphysical, not worthy of a university, but kind of realpolitik observation question. But I don't, for the life of me, understand how Carolyn Levitt can stand there at a lectern with a gold cross hanging from her neck and lie and defend the cruelty of an administration and a president who would send, by administrative error, a man to a hellhole in El Salvador and then fight all the way to the Supreme Court not to bring him back. So are our notions of good and evil screwed up right now? Yeah.
So again, I feel like Molly is tempting me towards this cross-examination. that I do. But so why is it wrong to send a human being to a cruel prison? Like, what does it mean to say that that's wrong, from your perspective?
I mean, well, we can have. I mean, we could take this in any number of directions.
Well,
like,
I want.
I mean, so like, I mean, are you asking me like?
Is that a fact? A fact about? Do you when
are you asking me? Is it wrong to send anyone for any reason to that? Or are you asking me about due process and presumptions of innocence and that sort of thing?
I'm asking you this: if you say it's wrong to send an innocent human being, or maybe any human being, to an inhumane prison, and you say, 5 + 5 = 10. To you, are those similar statements or different statements?
Well, I mean, they're different.
Are they both true?
They're different in terms of one is quantifiable and you cannot really have a debate about it. 5 + 5 is 10. And the other one you can have a debate about.
It's a strong statement, but I'll allow it.
The other one you can have a debate about because unless we're saying that arithmetic is an invented language, blah blah blah. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. But the other one, certainly there are all sorts of details and variables that would come into the conversation and that might lead people to have divergences of opinion. I think it's wrong on a really basic level that I don't need a creed or a set of commandments or a God to tell me to treat someone cruelly for no good reason, to consign someone to pain and torment for no good reason is immoral.
Okay,
End of
but
story.
You've just restated it, but why is it immoral?
Because it's not.
Persuade me.
But I think you seem to want me to say that like I would not have that belief if I hadn't had religion infused into me in various ways during my life. I think we can have those beliefs as people living in community, as people just with this wonderful degree of intelligence that maybe it is God-given, maybe not. I don't think that belief only arises from some sort of subconscious or subtle religious inculcation over time, if that's what you're asking me.
I'm not asking about inculcation, I guess. I do think that you believe that for reasons that are connected, whether or not to your own personal experience, to a larger inheritance from a religious tradition.
Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
What if we put it this way?
Is it because we have these notions of morality and then we validate them and we kind of like elucidate them and codify them in religion, or does the morality come from the religion?
Well, I think
does it matter?
Wait. You wanted me to put so.
All right.
So I think in certain cases you can actually identify some pretty clear breaks. Like there are situations where moral ideas clearly evolve really slowly over time. But in the case of the view that cruelty to weak parties is vile and inhumane, there is a pretty clear break in Western history with the rise of Christianity, right? Like the Roman pagans. I was just defending the continuity of ancient arguments and modern arguments, but I'll set that aside and say there is a pretty clear break in how people regard the dignity of the weak and the obligations of the strong that is connected to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and its impact on Roman and Western culture, right? So that is, I think, a case where an event enters human history or an idea enters human history that shapes community and is not simply shaped by community. But just to push a bit deeper, I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think that the person who doesn't want to say that there exists that there's some kind of transcendent moral architecture and wants to say that actually we can just sort of come to strong moral absolutes through a kind of collaborative process is suggesting that in the end it is kind of an aesthetic choice, right? Like you have a strong...
Or a survival advantage,
or a
right?
survival
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole Nicholas Christakis argument, is that actually we are like natural selection and evolution bring us toward communitarian values and caring for each other, because that actually is how the species survives. That's what his whole book Blueprint was about, for example.
Right, but those arguments, again, like if I was pointing a gun at someone and you were trying to persuade me not to shoot them, and it was clearly in my immediate interest to shoot them, right? I would benefit in some way. You would not persuade me not to shoot them by saying, have you read Nicholas Christakis' book Blueprint, which shows that actually, having a community that doesn't shoot people is good for the survival of the human species. That would not be a
So I should instead say you're going to go to hell.
You should, well, you don't have to say
that's where this is going, right?
You should suggest that I am doing something that will, you could say.
Damn you.
You could say that will. How about that will imperil my very being and separate me from what I am supposed to be as a human being.
But does the utility of that argument ipso facto make it true?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, I am aware that there are probably a lot of questions in the audience, so I'm going to ask one kind of final official moderated question to give you time to get your thoughts in order. And I think we've got a microphone here where we're asking folks to line up, and we'd love especially questions from students. The students who are here, please do not be shy. Here's my final question for this formal part. I'm wondering if you both could talk about how you think about our culture's gospel of authenticity. The message that seems to me college students today get pounded into them, and we all do by our culture, that the true source of meaning, the way to make your life mean something is to look deep inside you and find kind of the authentic version of you and nurture that, bring it to life, and find a place where you can express that, if that seems like a fair shorthand. Do you think that's a productive way of framing your process of investigating the universe? Do you think it's hazardous? How should we understand that message that our culture sends us? And meanwhile, line up with some good questions.
I think I'll just give a really brief answer. I think it's dangerous because it sounds to me like a really kind of long anagram for narcissism. And I think that, Ross used a really important word that should, I think, be like the governing word for so much earlier. He talked about balance. I would throw into balance a kind of moderation. It is important that you get to know yourself. And it is important that you listen to yourself, because that is kind of how you will figure out how to move through the world. But it's a really slippery slope in an easy way to end up self-obsessed, to end up kind of deaf and blind to the people around you if you are engaged in a constant investigation of your own authenticity. That sounds to me, again, like an anagram for narcissism.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I think I was trying to figure out a way to bring it around to...
Well, there's a way in which that whole language of authenticity is itself a cultural story, right? It's not that comes from deep inside us. That's a sort of 1960s message of what we're about as humans.
Right. Well, and it is a very American message in a way that goes back certainly to the Transcendentalists and Emerson and so on. I think that there is a way in which, there's a... I am a Christian and also an American in my own sort of temperament and impulses and so on. And there is a way in which those two things can be in tension, not just in sort of overt ways like what Frank's describing with elements of the Trump administration, where you end up supporting something that your country or your government is doing that is unchristian, but also in a larger way where, Christianity lays a great stress on humility and suffering and brokenness, and American culture lays a great stress on Promethean ambition and self-discovery, self-actualization, creation, and so on. And those can be hard things. Yeah, they're hard things to square. They are in tension. I think you could make an argument that it is better. We are all, not all of us, but most of us are Americans, right? And so if you're an American and a Christian, you are going to bring your sort of cultural inheritance and your cultural values into your relationship to Christian faith. And I don't think, this goes back to what I was saying about learning ambition in college. I don't think there's, short of becoming a monk, right? I don't think there's a way to live in the world as an American and completely purge yourself of certain kinds of very American ambition, but I think it's the sort of second best after leaving it all behind for the monastery. The second best is to try and make that ambition directed outward, right? To try and escape as much as you can from the trap of narcissism that Frank is describing, and saying, okay, maybe I am, as an American, likely to be 20% more worldly than the ideal Christian. But it's better to be worldly in a way where you are actually doing something in the world that affects other people, that builds something, that creates something, that does something, rather than having that worldliness expressed in a kind of perpetual sort of self-love and sort of, a kind of constant attempt to sort of turn inward to find the highest experience and the highest things. I don't know if that makes sense, but you were trying to coax something more out of me, so there it was.
We've got a long line of questions that will coax some more. So why don't we take 2 at a time? Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having this conversation. I've personally found it very enlightening and very interesting. I'm kind of curious about the way that you think of happiness and purpose as being two related but also separable concepts. And I'm wondering, do you each think of yourselves as being happy people? And is that relevant in the way that you also think about your sense of purpose?
That's a great question. And now let's take one more.
So I feel like a question that wasn't really answered earlier was about where your sense of morality came from, because I feel like the last even just 200 years, morality has greatly shifted. So I was wondering where your personal morality comes from, and I feel like that wasn't answered earlier. Thank you.
Yes, Frank, where does your personal morality come from? I don't honestly even think this is the most profitable way to lead you to God, so I feel, but
Got the happiness question, if you want to go with that one first.
Well, I'll do the personal morality first. That kind of assumes a fact, not an evidence. But I'm sure some of my personal morality does come from growing up in a culture in which I was exposed to religious belief in many forms. And there's a lot of overlap, by the way, in those various creeds, and in that overlap, I think is a lot of what we accept, a lot of what many of us accept as morality. I think some of it comes from your family or my family. I mean, my family had very strong ideas about how you took care of the people who mattered to you and what you owed them. I think a lot of us get our morality from family. And then I think we kind of, this isn't the right language, but we decide on some of it for ourselves. We move through the world. There are people, and again, I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but there are people and things we admire that we want to be like, that we want to emulate, and I think that becomes part of your personal morality.
Happiness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, I think, a pretty happy person, except when I was really sick, and I was very, very, very unhappy. For a fairly extended period of time. But overall, I think I have a very optimistic temperament, which sometimes surprises people, since I am, a conservative newspaper columnist, warning about hell. I don't know, occasionally expressing sort of dark views about our future AI overlords or whatnot. But no, but temperamentally, I am happy, and it is connected to purpose in a way that is, here I'll sound a bit more like Frank, but, there is sort of a, maybe I'll sound even a bit more like the American sort of finding their authentic self, right? But there is a way in which making a life is figuring out a way to make your temperament fit together with your lifestyle, fit together with your beliefs in a way that feels sort of organic and successful, right? And generally, I think I have done a good job of that. But I do think it's been always helpful for me to have a strong sense of, doing things that matter, that are connected to my own personal values and beliefs, but are also connected to sort of tangible things in the world. My wife and I have a, perhaps excessive number of children, And children supply purpose. They supply purpose through like unavoidable demands made upon your adult self at all times and all hours of the day, except when you escape to be on a panel discussion with other adults, right? And that's I think that's an example of, it doesn't have to come through children, but finding a vocation, finding a kind of work where you feel purposeful in what you're doing is definitely a tremendous source of support for a generally happy outlook on the world, I think. But there is, like Frank says, there's a chicken and egg thing too, right? Like, do I feel purposeful because I have a fairly happy temperament? To some degree, probably. But you are trying to work as you make a life to make those things fit together well, I think.
Let's take the next two questions.
Hi, I appreciate the relative grace of this conversation considering the political backgrounds. I have a question regarding that in terms of y'all's authority in media. So my question is, how do you support your view? How do you calm revolution in your position, and how do you inspire revolution in your position? And I think, that's my question.
Why don't I get to inspire the revolution?
Hey, one more.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is more about adversity in general, from academic challenges to challenges in the workplace to maintaining your sense of belonging in a world when you're no longer working in it. And my question is, do you have any advice for those who are questioning whether the challenge they're going through is something that is ugly, but you just need to get through it, perhaps because it's a rite of passage, versus something that is tough and you just need to gently set it down because your time and your efforts are worth putting towards something else?
Those are both very good questions, though. The first one, I have been very lucky in that I have spent my career writing for audiences that largely disagreed with me. And I say lucky because that's the goal of the writer, is to persuade, and you have more opportunities to persuade when you're writing for people who disagree with you. I don't know if I see my role as calming the revolution. I do sincerely think there are ways in which right-wing politics has become more revolutionary and liberal politics maybe less so in the last 20 years. Not that that's necessarily a good or a bad thing, just that that's sort of, in a way, the dynamic of our times. Donald Trump is definitely, in certain ways, a more radical figure than his Democratic opponents. But I've always seen my role as to sort of try and constantly assume good faith and start any disagreement with the strongest and best understanding of the other side's argument. So, and again, I'm sort of, to some degree, forced to this because I am literally writing for people who hold those arguments. So if I supply a caricature of my readers' arguments, they will, sort of reject everything I have to say because they'll know I'm caricaturing them. But that to me is sort of where effective disputation and argument begins, with an assumption that the people you disagree with hold their beliefs for good reasons. You can figure out what some of those reasons are, and you can talk to them if you acknowledge the good reasons that they hold those beliefs, and don't begin with the sort of worst possible view of their motives. That's not to say that people don't have bad motives for their beliefs. People do. People have good and bad motives, right? But if you're trying to have an effective argument with someone, you always want to find the good motivation and the good reason and start there. And any productive conversation, I think, can only begin with that kind of movement and that kind of gesture. And now, Frank, can give more practical life advice for the second question.
I'm the practical life advice
Yes.
person? Then we're all
yeah.
really in a lot of trouble. I've kind of forgotten the questions, but I just want to I want to build on what you said. I think it's really important. I think there are bad faith actors out there, and so I don't think in every situation you can say, I want to hear what you have to say, and I want to give dignity to it, because I think there are people who are not arguing or putting forth positions in good faith. But I do think it's really important that we always treat each other as human beings, right? And not as abstractions. And I think one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest kind of agents of our inability to discuss politics across lines, our inability to compromise, to have a kind of productive Congress and all that sort of stuff, is that everybody is dealing in abstractions and not in human beings. And I'm going to describe a situation that happens weekly with me. I bet you it happens more than weekly with Ross, where you will write something that someone disagrees with strongly, and you will get an extraordinarily heated, vitriolic, venomous, mean email. You'll get many of them, but you'll choose one maybe, and
I
you'll
try to only send you those emails like every other week, Frank.
and you will occasionally respond to one of them, and you will actually respond in a kind of civil way. You'll actually kind of engage the merits of the argument and not the name calling. And 99 out of 100 times, you get an email back in short order, and the person is tripping over themselves, apologizing to you and saying, actually, I think you're really a good writer. I love your relationship with your dog. I'm sorry I came out of the gate that way. Because now you're human beings with different opinions, as opposed to ideological crusaders under abstract banners. And I just think it's really important in the way we do our jobs and in the way all of us kind of move through the world, that we try to behave as human beings and not as abstractions, and we try to see the people around us that way.
So let me I don't want to leave the second question hanging. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to the question of when is suffering for something pointless versus when it's just sort of necessary to get where you're trying to go. I do think in the context of, meritocracy and academia and college and young professional life and so on, you shouldn't be able to, but you should be trying to essentially separate out things that you authentically desire and believe are really good from things that you feel like the system makes it natural for you to want to do, right? Because you're all in a system that is built on achievement. You have to achieve and achieve and achieve to get to a good school like UNC, maybe not Duke, but UNC, and then it's like, okay, well, what's the next achievement? What's the next test I'm supposed to take? What's the next obstacle I'm trying to get over, right? And part of the transition to adulthood, an integrated and happy adulthood, is transitioning from hurdle jumping and ladder climbing to I'm finding the thing that I'm supposed to do that actually makes a difference in the world, fits my personality, and makes me happy. And for the sake of the second thing, you have to be prepared to accept a lot of suffering. And for the sake of the first thing, you want to, cut bait as soon as you realize that you're just in it because it's what everybody else tries to do. But I can't tell you how to figure out the difference between those two things. But figuring out the difference to those two things is essential to making the right choices in your 20s and 30s. And I would say that valuing things that are not valued by the status competitions of the meritocracy, meaning place, family, romance, these kind of things. I already mentioned my children, but valuing those things early in life, when you're still being told to jump through hoops and climb the next ladder and so on, that can really make, I think, a big difference in how you feel about your life once you reach the ripe old age that Frank and I have both attained.
I think I'm a lot riper than you are. Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left, so why don't we take 2 more questions, and this will be our attempt to sum up this meaning of the universe quest we're on.
Okay, thank you for both being here. It was a great conversation. First, I'd like to give a big thanks to Ross Douthat. I got confirmed in the Catholic Church last year. I used to be Pentecostal Christian. That's not necessarily
Don't tell
encouraging.
the Protestants
Yeah,
that I had any role to play in
but I
that.
got to
My
give you
God,
a
come
shout
on.
out because,
No, thank you.
like water on a rock, you convinced me slowly to explore Catholicism, and then now I'm confirmed Catholic. But my question is for Ross Douthat. What would be your case to the audiences to explore Catholicism? 1 Peter 3:15 says we must have a reason for hope that we can explain to people in case anyone asks. So what's your reason for people here, from college students to older community members, to explore Catholicism? Thank you.
I have like a similar question. I wanted to ask how religious people should respond to a left that is much more comfortable with its own moral outrage and that's much more comfortable taking these morally absolutist stands, and how you as people of faith like come to the conversation in good faith, responding to those people.
I'm going to have to pull Frank into these answers. I'm going to
I get a
outsource
vacation from this,
Catholicism. Yeah. So on the second point, I do think that it is. I think Frank had a good descriptive point about how the left of the Democratic Party has evolved over both of our lifetimes, where in the 1980s and 1990s, you would generally hear conservatives complain that the left were all moral relativists. Today, in various ways, you could argue that the left is sometimes more morally certain of itself than the right is. And I think that there's two ways, I think, that two somewhat different ways that Christians and religious believers who are not on the left can respond to that, right? One is to see the downside of it and to see in it a warning against the vices of intolerance and hypocrisy and self-righteousness, right? Like the fact that certain Americans were turned off by the religious right in the 1990s and then were turned off by the woke left in the late 2010s and early 2020s does tell you something about the limits of self-righteousness in politics, right? And there is a way in which if you don't like some of the self-righteousness of the left today, maybe it holds up a mirror to certain negative tendencies on the conservative or religious right, and you can learn something from that about not being too self-righteous. At the same time, there's also a kind of opportunity of the kind that I've unsuccessfully taken with my dear colleague here of saying, man, you have really strong moral convictions. Let's talk about, what are those convictions rooted in? What does the fact that you have these convictions say about the nature of human beings and the nature of the universe, right? And there is a way in which I think that can open into larger conversations that are very positive and fruitful ones to have, again, even if they haven't pulled, Frank into the religious fold in the last hour. I don't think I did a very good job. On Catholicism, again, Veritas is an ecumenical organization. I'm not here to make a vehement pitch for Roman Catholicism as the one true faith. So I'll say something that's specific to my own view of Roman Catholicism that can apply, I think, to people's religious journeys writ large, right? Which is that one of my profound convictions is that people who are interested in religious matters and interested in the big question should proceed on the assumption that the world is not a trick, that God is not out to get you, the universe isn't out to fool you, it hasn't hidden the truth about existence in the hands of one tribe somewhere in Western Alaska, and you're never going to get there, and sorry, joke's on you, we're never going to figure it out. And what I was trying to get at in my failed, excursion into ancient Roman arguments was that I think in every time and place, people ask big questions and answers are available. They were available in the ancient world, they're available in the modern world. It doesn't mean that you can get all the way to perfect certainty about reality, but I think one genuine difference I have with Frank is that I think you can get a bit further, that like the universe does yield somewhat to interest and exploration. You can't figure out every truth through reason alone, but you can figure out some important truths. And when you're doing that, and if that leads you into a religious quest, I think you are looking for a religion, a tradition, a church, a denomination that fits, the complexity and diversity of the human species, that fits with, the larger patterns of the universe, that seems big enough in certain ways, not necessarily in like absolute numbers. That's something Catholics probably brag about too much, right? But like in terms of how capacious it is, that it seems like the kind of religion that a God who's not out to get you would have set up for you to be welcomed into. And I think any church that you enter ultimately should have that feeling for you. And maybe it has that feeling even though it only has 5 members. Like something can feel incredibly large and be in fact incredibly small, right? But that sense of largeness of a worldview that seems like it was set up to welcome you in, I think is what people on a sincere religious quest should be looking for. So, Frank, last word. No, I'm just kidding.
I have nothing to add to that. I'll just say one thing to the student who asked the very earnest question about what you should suffer through and what you should not and how you make that decision. This is not a religious statement. This isn't even a suffering thing. But one thing I wish more people had said to me when I was in college and contemplating situations or questions like that is life is long and nothing is irrevocable. As you're trying to make that decision, you will have a chance in some measure, in some form, to revisit that decision. And it's not whatever you decide in the moment. If it turns out, in retrospect, to seem like the wrong decision, if it's immediately revealed as an imperfect decision, there's nothing in life that can't be revisited.
And we're narrative creatures, so
Yes.
even if it's a terrible decision, we'll find a way to weave it into our stories of ourselves.
Develop a whole new religion for it.
That's right. Please join me in thanking Frank and Ross.